The dust had barely settled on the cobblestones of Salvation Creek when Thomas Hartwell knew his life would never be the same. Blood still stained his knuckles from the fight, and the torn fabric of his best Sunday shirt hung loose against his chest. Behind him, the saloon doors swung lazily in the evening breeze, carrying with them the echoes of cruel laughter and bitter words that would haunt him for years to come. "Fool rancher," someone had spat. "Thinks he's some kind of knight in shining armor." Thomas pulled his hat low over his eyes and mounted his horse, feeling the weight of 100 stares burning into his back. The girl he'd saved, Elena Rodriguez, the blacksmith's daughter, stood safely behind her father now, her dark eyes filled with gratitude and something else he dared not name. But gratitude meant nothing to the men who'd cornered her in that alley, and it meant even less to the townspeople who now whispered behind their hands about the rancher who dared to interfere as his horse carried him away from Salvation Creek. Thomas didn't know that in less than 24 hours those same streets would echo with the sound of 100 horses, and his name would be spoken not with mockery, but with reverence. Chapter 1. The Weight of Honor. 3 months earlier, Thomas Hartwell had been a different man. His ranch stretched across the valley like a green promise, cattle dotting the horizon like scattered prayers. He'd built it all with his own hands after returning from the war, each fence post driven deep into the earth like a stake in his future. At 32, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in 3 counties, with land enough to support a family and a reputation for fairness that extended beyond the borders of his property. But Thomas carried secrets heavier than the gold in his strongbox. In his bedroom dresser, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath winter blankets, lay a letter he'd never had the courage to send. It was addressed to Elena Rodriguez, written in his careful script during those long nights when sleep wouldn't come and the wind through the eaves sounded like whispered confessions. He'd loved her since the day she'd arrived in Salvation Creek. 5 years ago, a 17-year-old girl with eyes like midnight and a smile that could gentle the wildest Mustang. Her father, Diego Rodriguez, had set up his blacksmith shop on the edge of town, and Elena had quickly become known for her kindness, her quick wit, and her stubborn refusal to be courted by any of the local men. Thomas had watched from afar, telling himself that a simple rancher had no business dreaming of such an extraordinary woman. Elena deserved better than a man who woke screaming from nightmares about distant battlefields. Better than someone who sometimes forgot how to be gentle after years of learning how to kill, so he'd kept his distance, content to catch glimpses of her at church on Sundays or when he brought his horses to her father's shop for shoeing. He'd memorized the way she moved, the musical sound of her laugh, the gentle way she spoke to frightened animals, and he'd written letter after letter, pouring his heart onto paper, then carefully folding each one away with all the others he'd never have the courage to deliver. The night everything changed began like any other. Thomas had ridden into town to pick up supplies and maybe share a drink with the few men he called friends. The Broken Wheel Saloon was crowded with the usual mix of cowboys, drifters and gamblers, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the sound of cards. Slapping against worn wooden tables, Thomas was nursing his second whiskey when he heard the commotion outside. At first, he paid it no mind. Saturday nights in Salvation Creek often included their share of scuffles and raised voices. But something about the tone of the voices, something sharp and predatory, made him set down his glass and push through the crowd toward the door. The alley beside the saloon was dark, lit only by the yellow glow spilling from the establishment's windows. Thomas saw them immediately, 3 men cornering a figure in a light-colored dress. Even in the dim light, he recognized the proud set of those shoulders, the defiant tilt of that chin. "Elena, come now, sweetheart," one of the men was saying, his voice thick with alcohol and ugly intention. "No need to make this difficult. We just want to show you a good time. Please." Elena's voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the thread of fear running through it. "I need to get home. My father will be worried." "Your father ain't here," another man laughed. "What he don't know won't hurt him." Why, Thomas felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same calm that had descended on him during the war when killing became a necessity rather than a choice. His hand moved instinctively to his side, where his Colt revolver rested in its worn leather holster. "Gentlemen," Thomas stepped into the alley, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe the lady asked, you too leave her be." The three men turned, and Thomas recognized them immediately. The Garrison brothers, Jake, Pete, and Sam, a trio of troublemakers who owned a small spread north of town and had a reputation for taking what they wanted without asking. They were drunk enough to be dangerous and sober enough to be mean. Well, Jake Garrison, the eldest, grinned with teeth like broken fence posts. "If it ain't the war hero himself." "This ain't your concern, Hartwell." "Making it my concern," Thomas replied, taking another step forward. Behind the brothers, Alina pressed herself against the alley wall, her eyes wide but alert. "You sure about that?" Pete Garrison's hand dropped to his gun. 3 against 1 ain't exactly sporting odds. Thomas smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I've faced worse odds with less at stake." What happened next was over in less than 30 seconds. Pete went for his gun first, and Thomas put him down with a right cross that sent him sprawling into a pile of empty crates. Sam charged like a bull, and Thomas sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the wall beside Alina, who nimbly stepped aside. Jake was the dangerous one, the one who actually managed to clear leather before Thomas reached him. But Thomas had been fighting for his life since he was 18 years old, and Jake Garrison was no Confederate sharpshooter. Thomas caught Jake's wrist, twisted until the gun clattered to the ground, then drove his knee into the man's solar plexus hard enough to drop him, gasping to his knees, in the sudden silence that followed. Thomas could hear his own breathing, sharp and controlled, and the soft sound of Elena's skirts as she stepped away from the wall. "Are you hurt?" he asked without turning around, his eyes still fixed on the 3 groaning men. "No." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas, I get out of here," Thomas said to the Garrison brothers, his voice flat and final. "All 3 of you. And if I hear about you bothering Miss Rodriguez again, we'll finish this conversation with bullets instead of fists." Pete and Sam helped Jake to his feet, all 3 of them shooting murderous looks at Thomas as they stumbled toward the mouth of the alley. But they went, which was what mattered. Only when they were gone did Thomas turn to face Alina. She stood, with her back against the wall, her dress torn at the shoulder, and her dark hair mussed. But her eyes were bright with something that made Thomas's heart skip like a stone across water. "Thank you," she said, and the simple words carried more weight than any of the letters he'd never sent. Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "No need for thanks, miss. Just glad I was here." Lena stepped forward, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of roses in her hair, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Thomas," she said, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer, "I need to tell you something." But before she could continue, voices erupted from the saloon behind them. Someone had heard the commotion, and now half the establishment was pouring into the alley to see what had happened. "Oh, what's all this?" Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Sheriff," Thomas said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." But the damage was already done. In the crowd gathered behind the sheriff, Thomas could see faces he recognized, men from town, cowboys from neighboring ranches, even Reverend McKinney from the church. And in their eyes, he saw not admiration for what he'd done, but something else. Entirely suspicion, judgment. The kind of looks reserved for men who stepped outside the unwritten rules of proper society. Is that so? The sheriff's gaze moved. Between Thomas, Alina, and the overturned crates where the fight had taken place. "Miss Rodriguez, are you all right?" Alina lifted her chin, and Thomas saw the pride that had first captured his heart blazing in her eyes. "I'm fine, Sheriff Morrison. Mr. Hartwell came to my aid when some men were ... bothering me." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Thomas felt his stomach sink. He'd been a fool to think this would end quietly. In a town like Salvation Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, a story like this would spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. "I see." Sheriff Morrison's tone was carefully neutral. "Well then, I suppose we should all get back to our business." The crowd began to disperse, but Thomas could feel their eyes lingering, could hear the whispered conversations already beginning. By morning, every person in 3 counties would know that Thomas Hartwell had gotten into a fight over Elena Rodriguez. and the speculation about what had really happened in that alley would grow with each telling. Alina, Thomas started to say, but she was already being led away by her father, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with worry creasing his weathered face. As Diego Rodriguez hurried his daughter toward home, Lena looked back over her shoulder at Thomas. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that brief connection, Thomas saw everything he'd ever dreamed of and everything he knew he'd never have. Because by the time the sun rose on Salvation Creek, the story of what had happened in that alley had already begun to change. Chapter 2. The price of heroism. Thomas spent the next 3 days discovering exactly how quickly a man's reputation could crumble in a small town. The first whispers began Sunday morning during church service. He felt the stares as he took his usual seat in the back pew, heard the sudden hush that fell over conversations when he passed. By Monday, when he rode into town for supplies, the whispers had grown bold enough to be spoken aloud. "Heard Hartwell got into a fight over that Mexican girl," someone said as Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post outside Davidson's general store. "Mighty strange coincidence. Him being there right when she needed rescuing," came another voice. "Makes a man wonder what he was really doing in that alley." Thomas kept his face impassive as he climbed the steps to the store, but each word hit him like a physical blow. He'd lived in this town for 7 years, had helped his neighbors through droughts and harsh winters, had even used his own money to help rebuild the church after a fire. None of that seemed to matter now. Inside the store, Mrs. Davidson gave him a look that could have curdled fresh milk. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice arctic, "I suppose you'll be wanting your usual supplies." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied quietly, setting his list on the counter. As Mrs. Davidson gathered his order with sharp, efficient movements, Thomas became aware of the other customers in the store. The Jameson twins, young women who usually giggled and blushed when he tipped his hat to them, now stood whispering behind their hands near the fabric display. Old Pete Michaels, who'd shared many a drink with Thomas over the years, suddenly found the contents of the pickle barrel fascinating. Whenever Thomas looked his way, "That'll be $12.30, Mrs. Davidson announced, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Payment up front." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He'd had credit at Davidson's for years, had never missed a payment or given them reason to doubt his word. But he counted out the coins without complaint, gathered his supplies, and headed for the door. "Mr. Hartwell," Mrs. Davidson called after him. "In the future, it might be best if you conducted your business elsewhere. We prefer to serve customers with better judgment." The words followed Thomas out onto the street like a slap across the face. He loaded his supplies into his saddlebags with mechanical precision, aware of the faces watching him from windows and doorways. When he swung into the saddle, he caught sight of Elena emerging from the bank with her father. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Thomas saw something in her expression that made his chest a calm mixture of gratitude, longing, and profound sadness. She started to lift her hand, perhaps to wave, but her father noticed and quickly guided her in the opposite direction. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he heard hoofbeats approaching his ranch. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps Elena had found a way to come to him, to explain what she'd been trying to say in the alley. But the rider who emerged from the gathering dusk was Jake Garrison, his face still bearing the bruises from their encounter 3 nights before. "Hartwell," Jake said, staying mounted but letting his hand rest casually on his gun. "Figured it was time we had ourselves a talk." Thomas rose slowly from his chair, his own hand moving to his weapon. "I thought we already said everything that needed saying." Jake's smile was ugly. "See, that's where you're wrong. It cost me something the other night, and I aim to collect. I cost you the chance to assault an innocent woman. I'd say that makes us even innocent." Jake laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Is that what you think she is? Hell, Hartwell, for a smart man, you sure are stupid." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. "Say what you came to say, Garrison." "Gladly." Jake leaned forward in his saddle. "See, the thing about that little Mexican gal is, she ain't quite as pure as she pretends. Word is, she's been meeting someone secret like, someone she can't be seen with in daylight." "You're lying." "Am I?" Jake's grin widened. "Ask yourself this. Hartwell, What was she doing in that alley in the first place? Sweet little church girl like her, out alone after dark. Mighty strange behavior for someone who's supposed to be so innocent. The words hit Thomas like bullets, not because he believed them, but because he could already see how they would spread through town like poison. The same people who were already whispering about his motives would seize on this new rumor with vicious enthusiasm. Spread that lie, Thomas said quietly, and I'll kill you. Jake's hand tightened on his gun. That sounds like a threat, Hartwell. It's a promise. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the porch, the air heavy with the potential for violence. Then Jake slowly relaxed his grip on his weapon. "Won't need to spread anything," he said. "Truth has a way of coming out all by itself. You just wait and see." After Jake rode away, Thomas stood on his porch until full darkness fell, wrestling with doubts he hated himself for having. He knew Elena Rodriguez was everything good and pure in the world, knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name. But Jake's poison had found its mark, not in Thomas's heart, but in his understanding of how cruel small towns could be to anyone who dared to be different. The next morning brought confirmation of his fears. Thomas rode into town. He could feel the change immediately. Where before there had been whispers and sidelong glances, now there was open hostility. Men stepped out of his path with exaggerated gestures. Women pulled their children closer when he passed. And more than once he heard Elena's name spoken with a sneer that made his hands curl into fists at the post office. Jeremiah Weeks, the postmaster, looked up from his sorting with barely concealed contempt. "Morning, Hartwell," Weeks said. "Surprised to see you showing your face in town." "Just collecting my mail," Thomas replied evenly. "Of course you are." Weeks made a show of rifling through the mail slots. "Funny thing, though, been hearing some interesting stories about what really happened in that alley. Makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you might have had with that Rodriguez girl." Thomas felt his control begin to slip. "What kind of arrangement?" Weeks shrugged. "The kind that needs to happen in dark places where decent folks can't see. The kind that ends with staged rescues and grateful rewards." This time, Thomas didn't think. His hand shot across the counter and grabbed Weeks by the shirt front, dragging him halfway through the mail slot. "You take that back," Thomas growled, his voice deadly quiet. I was just saying what everyone's thinking." Weeks stammered, his face white with fear. "Then everyone's wrong." Thomas released the postmaster and stepped back, his chest heaving. Behind him, he could hear voices gathering, drawn by the commotion. When he turned, he found himself facing a crowd of townspeople, their faces hard with judgment and suspicion. "That's enough." Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand on his gun. "I think you'd better come with me." "For what?" Thomas asked. "Defending myself against lies?" "For disturbing the peace," Morrison replied. "And for your own good. Things are getting ugly, and they're likely to get uglier." As the sheriff led him toward the jail, Thomas caught sight of Elena standing in the doorway of her father's shop. Her face was pale as bone, her dark eyes filled with anguish as she watched him being led away. Their gazes met for just a moment, and Thomas saw his own heartbreak reflected in her expression. Behind her, Diego Rodriguez appeared and quickly pulled his daughter back inside. But not before Thomas saw the tear that traced a silver path down Elena's cheek. That single tear would haunt him through the long night he spent in Sheriff Morrison's jail, and through the morning that brought news that would change everything. Chapter 3. The revelation. Thomas woke to the sound of commotion in the street. Through the barred window of his cell, he could see people running, their voices raised in excitement and confusion. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of Elena's blush the first time he'd ever spoken to her. Sheriff Morrison appeared at the cell door, his face grim but his eyes holding something. That might have been respect. "Time to go, Hartwell," Morrison said, fitting the key into the lock. "Seems like you've got some visitors." "Visitors?" Thomas stood, brushing the straw from his clothes. He'd spent the night on a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the woman who'd probably lost her reputation because of his foolish attempt at heroism. "See for yourself." Morrison swung the cell door open. So I'll warn you, this is about the strangest thing I've seen in 20 years of wearing this badge. Thomas followed the sheriff out of the jail and onto the main street of Salvation Creek. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. Horses, dozens of them, lined up in perfect formation down the center of the street. But these weren't the usual cow ponies and work horses he was accustomed to seeing. These were magnificent animals, bays and chestnuts and blacks that gleamed like polished leather in the morning sun. Their tack was elaborate, decorated with silver and intricate tooling that spoke of wealth and refinement in their riders. Thomas blinked, certain he was still dreaming. The men mounted on those beautiful horses wore clothing unlike anything he'd ever seen in Salvation Creek. Rich fabrics in deep colors, embroidered vests, wide-brimmed hats, adorned with silver concos. They sat their horses with the easy grace of men born to the saddle. But there was something more, a dignity, an otherworldly quality that made them seem like figures from a legend. At their head rode a man who could only be their leader. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a mustache waxed to sharp points. His eyes were dark and intelligent, and when they fixed on Thomas, they held a warmth that was completely unexpected. "Sinner Hartwell," the man said, his accent cultured and precise. "I am Don Fernando Rodriguez, and these are my men. We have come to thank you." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Rodriguez, Elena's surname, but this man was clearly no simple blacksmith. The elaborate clothing, the magnificent horses, the bearing of natural command, this was a man of significant wealth and power. "I'm sorry," Thomas managed. "I think there's been some mistake." Don Fernando smiled, and Thomas saw Elena in the curve of his lips, the warm intelligence in his eyes. "There is no mistake, Sana. You see, my daughter has told me what you did. For her, how you protected her honor when lesser men would have looked the other way. How you sacrificed your own reputation to preserve hers." The crowd that had gathered to stare at the magnificent procession murmured at these words. Thomas could see faces he recognized: Mrs. Davidson from the general store, the Jameson twins, Jeremiah Weeks from the post office, all of them staring in shock at this unexpected revelation. "Your daughter?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Elena Rodriguez is my only child," Don Fernando confirmed. "My heir, in the light of my life." When she told me of your heroic actions, I knew I had to come and express my gratitude personally. Behind Don Fernando, the riders Thomas counted at least 100 of them, sat motionless in their saddles. But their presence spoke volumes. This was not a man who traveled lightly, not someone whose gratitude could be dismissed or ignored. "I don't understand," Sheriff Morrison spoke up. "Elena's father is Diego Rodriguez, the blacksmith." Don Fernando's smile grew warmer. "Diego is my younger brother, Sheriff. A good man who chose a simpler life than the one he was born to." "When?" "Elena expressed a desire to see something of the world beyond our hacienda. I allowed her to spend time with her uncle, to experience life as an ordinary young woman." The pieces began to fall into place in Thomas's mind. Elena's grace, her education, the way she carried herself with unconscious dignity, it all made sense now. She wasn't the simple blacksmith's daughter she'd appeared to be. She was the daughter of what was clearly a very wealthy and powerful landowner. "But why the secrecy?" Thomas asked. Don Fernando's expression grew serious. "In Mexico, Senor, there are those who would harm a wealthy man's daughter for gold or for revenge. Elena's safety was paramount, but so was her happiness. She wished to be seen for herself, not for her father's wealth." One of the riders urged his horse forward, and Thomas saw that it was Diego Rodriguez, but transformed. Gone were the simple clothes of a blacksmith, replaced by the rich garments of a man of means. His bearing, too, had changed. He had seemed like a humble craftsman. Now he carried himself with the same quiet dignity as his brother. "Senator Thomas," Diego said formally, "I owe you an apology. I've watched you for months, seen the way you look at my niece with respect and admiration. I knew your feelings were honorable, but I could not reveal the truth without endangering Elena's secret." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the revelations crashing over him like waves. "Hey, where is Elena?" he asked. Don Fernando's eyes twinkled. "Ah, she insisted on coming. Of course. My daughter is strong-willed. He turned in his saddle and called out something in rapid Spanish. The formation of riders parted like a curtain, and through the gap rode a figure that made Thomas's heart stop. Alina sat a magnificent white mare with the grace of a queen. But it wasn't her superb horsemanship that took his breath away, it was the transformation in her appearance. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, held in place by what appeared to be a golden comb set with emeralds. Her dress was a creation of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and hold the morning light. Round her throat lay a necklace of pearls that must have been worth more than Thomas's entire ranch. But her eyes, her wonderful, familiar eyes, were the same. They held the same warmth, the same intelligence, the same gentle strength that had first captured his heart. And when they met his across the dusty street, they held something else as well. Love. Pure, uncomplicated, and unmistakable. Alina guided her mare forward until she was close enough to touch. Then, in full view of the entire town, she spoke in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "Thomas Hartwell," she said, and her voice was like music. "3 nights ago, you risked everything to protect me. You knew it would cost you, but you did it anyway because it was right. That is the mark of a truly honorable man." She reached into a small bag tied to her saddle and withdrew something that made the watching crowd gasp. It was a ring, a simple band of gold set with a single diamond that caught the morning sun and threw rainbows across the dusty street. "My father has given me permission to ask you a question," Alina continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "Thomas Hartwell, will you marry me?" The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Around him, the people of Salvation Creek stared in shock at this reversal of fortune. The man they'd been ready to run out of town on a rail was being proposed to by what was clearly a woman of extraordinary wealth and position. Thomas looked up at Alina, sitting her horse like a fairy tale princess, offering him everything he'd ever dreamed of and more. 3 days ago, these same people had been ready to believe the worst of both of them. Now they watched in stunned silence as their assumptions crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. "Alina," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have nothing to offer you. I'm just a simple rancher with a few hundred head of cattle and a mortgage on my land." Alina's smile was radiant. "You have everything I want, Thomas. You have honor and courage and a heart that loves truly. What more could any woman ask for?" Don Fernando cleared his throat. "Perhaps, Senor, you would prefer to discuss this matter in private. My men and I have ridden far, and we could use refreshment. I believe your town has a hotel." Thomas nodded, still reeling from the morning's revelations. "Salvation Creek Inn. Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment." "Excellent." Now, Don Fernando turned to address the crowd. "Good people of Salvation Creek, I thank you for your hospitality to my daughter during her stay in your town. Tonight I would like to invite all of you to join us for a celebration. There will be food, music, and dancing in the street. It will be our way of showing appreciation for the way you have welcomed Alina." The crowd began to murmur with excitement, their earlier hostility toward Thomas apparently forgotten in the face of Don Fernando's obvious wealth and generosity. Thomas watched their faces change with a mixture of amazement and disgust. 3 days ago, these same people had been ready to believe the worst of him. Now they smiled and nodded as if they'd never doubted his character for a moment. As the magnificent procession began to move toward the hotel, Ina guided her mare close to Thomas. "Walk with me," she asked softly. Thomas nodded and fell into step beside her horse, aware of the eyes following their every movement. But for the first time in 3 days, he didn't care what anyone else thought. All that mattered was the woman riding beside him, and the future that stretched out before them like a golden promise. Chapter 4. Truth and Consequences that afternoon. As the town buzzed with preparations for Don Fernando's promised celebration, Thomas found himself in the unlikely position of sitting in the parlor of the Salvation Creek Inn, holding a cup of fine china and trying to process the complete upheaval of his world. Alina sat across from him, still wearing her magnificent blue silk dress, but with her hair now arranged more simply. The golden comb with emeralds lay on a small table between them, catching the light from the lace-curtained windows. Without the elaborate styling, she looked more like the Alina he'd fallen in love with. Though the expensive clothes were a constant reminder of how much he still didn't know about her. Don, friendo, occupied the wing-back chair near the fireplace, his presence commanding even in repose. Diego Rodriguez stood by the window, looking out at the street where townspeople hurried back and forth, preparing for the evening's festivities. "I imagine you have questions, Senor," Don Fernando said, his dark eyes kind but measuring. Thomas set down his teacup with careful precision. "A few," he admitted. "Ask them. A man should know what he's accepting when he takes a wife." Thomas looked at Alina, who gave him an encouraging nod. "How long have you known?" "About my feelings for Alina, I mean." Diego turned from the window. "Months," he said simply. "You are not as subtle as you think, amigo. Every time you brought your horses to my shop, every Sunday at church, it was written on your face for anyone to see. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because—" Alina spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "I asked him not to. Thomas, I needed to know that your feelings were real, not influenced by my father's wealth or position. I needed to know that you cared for me, not for what I could bring to a marriage." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You'd think I would have known," Alina said quickly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "I never thought that. But I had to be certain. Too many men have courted me for my dowry rather than for myself." Don Fernando nodded gravely. "Alina has been pursued by many suitors, Senor, sons of other wealthy families, men with titles and vast holdings, but she has refused them all. When she told me about you, about your kindness, your integrity, the way you treated her with respect rather than as a prize to be won, I knew she had found something rare. But the secrecy," Thomas said. "Why continue the pretense?" Alina's grip on his hand tightened. "Because I was happy here. For the first time in my life, I was just Alina, not Don Fernando's daughter, with all the expectations that come with that name. I could choose my own friends, make my own decisions even. Work alongside my uncle in his shop when I wanted to. It was ... freedom." Thomas began to understand. "When those men cornered you in the alley, I was terrified," Alina admitted. "Not just of what they might do, but of what it would mean. If they had succeeded, if they had harmed me, the secret would have come out in the worst possible way. There would have been violence, possibly bloodshed. My father would have demanded justice, and innocent people might have been hurt." Don Fernando's expression darkened. "Those men are fortunate that you intervened, Senor. Had my daughter been harmed?" He left the sentence unfinished. But the implication was clear. "Instead," Alina continued, "you appeared like an answer to prayer. You protected me without asking anything in return, without even knowing who I really was. You were willing to sacrifice your reputation, your standing, in this community, to do what was right. That told me everything I needed to know about the man I'd fallen in love with." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was saying. "Alina, I need you to understand something. I'm not the man you think I am. I've done things, seen things during the war that stop." Alina's voice was firm. "You think my family's wealth was built on gentle dealings? You think my father has never had to make hard choices, never had to fight to protect what matters to him?" Thomas. "I know about your nightmares," Uncle Diego told me. "I know about the letters you've written, but never sent he found one that fell from your saddlebag months ago." Thomas felt his face burn with embarrassment. "You read it?" Alina's cheeks turned pink. "Uncle Diego brought it to me. He was concerned about your feelings and wanted my guidance on how to handle the situation. Thomas, that letter was the most beautiful thing I've ever read. The way you wrote about love, about wanting to be worthy of someone's heart, it made me cry. I wrote dozens of them," Thomas admitted. "Kept them all in my dresser like a fool." "Not like a fool," Alina said softly. "Like a man who values words, who thinks before he speaks, who wants to be certain of his heart before he acts on it. Do you know how rare that is?" Don Fernando cleared his throat. "Which brings us to more practical matters. That she wishes to marry you, and you have accepted her proposal, actually." Thomas interrupted. "I haven't given her an answer yet." Silence fell over the room. Elena's hand went still in his, and he could feel her tension. "Thomas," she whispered. He looked into her eyes, those wonderful dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for months, and knew what he had to say. "Elena Rodriguez," he said formally, "I've loved you since the day I first saw you in your uncle's shop, wearing a leather apron and trying to gentle a frightened horse. I've written you 100 letters I was too scared to send, dreamed about you every night, and spent every Sunday in church praying for the courage to speak to you." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "3 days ago, I nearly lost everything because I couldn't bear to see you hurt. I'd do it again tomorrow, because protecting you, loving you, is worth any price I might have to."